Hi there, Steve here again. I'm going to talk a bit about my Korean studies, and I want to talk again about the issue of input and language learning and literacy. First of all, I've spent probably about an hour and a half working on my iPad, reading content, Korean content in iLink, in the app, and I've been doing a lot of highlighting of phrases, because then these phrases, and as I highlight the phrase, I try to highlight something that I think will reappear. Something that I think is a phrase that is so common, not specific to this context, but somewhat of a general phrase that I'm likely to see it again. And in fact, I often do. And so it helps me to kind of focus in on handy phrases that are repeatable and that I can use in the language. So I'm continuing with my input-based activities, largely with regard to Korean. I've hardly spoken at all. I'm going to try to line up a couple of conversations next week. I want to talk about the language conference in Boston. And I went over my notes again, and I went through their brochure of all the presenters and stuff. And at the end of my little talk, I'm going to ramble for quite a while here. I'm going to see if I can add on some of my videos from the conference to give you a sense of the mood. As I say, it was lots of enthusiastic teachers. I enjoyed it. And if I look at some of the main themes there, obviously one was technology. People all were embracing technology. How useful it is, I don't know. It looks like Google and their suite of products for the classroom are taking over because they're offered free of charge, and enables the students to connect with each other. And the idea is that we now live in this era of 21st century literacy or new literacy, and we should help the kids engage with all this technology, or the kids already have it and we have to, in the classroom, the teachers have to accommodate them. I'm not convinced that it's all that useful, and I will explain why. But anyway, that was one feature, and it kind of ties into this other thing that came up all the time, and that is classroom activities. In other words, the teachers are constantly looking at what can they do in the classroom, which is understandable because they have 25, 30, 35 kids in the classroom. They have to find something for the kids to do. So they have, them making videos, editing videos, sharing videos, using some Google platform to do it. They have various forms of guided reading, guided conversations, getting the students to talk about whatever they've been doing. So, I mean, that's fine as far as it goes. However, and then there was also there was a lot of discussion of testing and evaluation and how best to evaluate kids. And so we have them doing these activities, and then we evaluate their performance and so forth and so on. Now, I assume that the same kind of discussion takes place with regard to all subjects that are taught at school. In other words, much of the discussion is about technology, activities in the classroom, and evaluation. However, when we consider that 80% or some such number of people who are in prison read at a grade 4 level, that half of the kids that attend university in the United States, and presumably Canada is the same, require remedial English. When we consider that, 30, 40% of the population, again, in North America, has a very low level of functional literacy. When we consider how important, good literacy skills are, how the people with the highest 20, 30% literacy skills have the best incomes, jobs, whatever, and that's not to say that people with poor literacy skills can't be successful. I've worked with people who have poor literacy skills and who are very good at what they do, and they're not less valuable human beings for the fact that they don't read very well. But the reality is that in education, in the workplace, statistically, you're more likely to be successful if you read well. And it's also been shown that kids who have poor reading skills at grade 1, 2, 3, they never catch up. So with all of the Google technology and planned activities and enthusiastic teachers, in fact, a lot of people don't learn to read very well. And that might be the major contributor to inequality unemployment, crime, and other social ills that cost the society a lot of money and, of course, can be quite devastating for the people involved. So I ask myself, how effective is all of this technology and concern about activities and all the well-intended, and I might add into that this whole teaching people critical thinking and intercultural skills and all this other sociolinguistics and all that stuff, when the fundamental issue is, and there was a presenter who made the point that really everything we learn is based on our literacy skills. And literacy skills means words. If you don't have words, you can't read. And so, and in fact, I've seen studies in the past that showed that math and science courses require a higher degree of literacy, a more complex, vocabulary. The lexical index of those science and math texts is higher. So if people struggle to read, they will struggle with math and they will struggle with science. So reading skills are so fundamentally important. And I think there's a real relationship between teaching foreign languages and teaching literacy in the native language. Both relate to a lot of input and a lot of words. So this brings us to the subject of input. And here there were various discussions about, people, another buzzword was authentic content. So, teachers were looking for things like YouTube videos, ads, stuff written on shopping bags, on receipts. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, on the one hand, they're talking about authentic content. On the other hand, Krashen talks about compelling input. Now, would we read receipts, shopping bags, and advertisements in English? Is that compelling input for us in our own language? I don't think so. Why would they? Because it's exotic, it comes from this other language that we're learning. Why does that become compelling input? One presenter talked about some ad about brushing your teeth, and that would be a great in for a discussion in the class where we can really focus on, it was on washing your hands. And so then we can focus on all kinds of things that relate to washing your hands and the difference between a flu and a cold and stuff. But why is that necessarily compelling for a student? I don't know. Compelling input, and I agree with the concept that as long as you expose people to things that are interesting to them and accessible, and here again, a concept that came up was the zone of proximal difficulty. In other words, something that's not too difficult for you. And if it's meaningful for you, and if you're interested in it, you're going to learn the language. If you read, and I would add listening, because the two go together. And I think that is true for foreign language learning, and it's true for literacy development. Let people choose what they're interested in, something that's just a little bit difficult for them, and away they go. And as Krashen and Van Patten pointed out, and I thought this was quite an interesting statement, where Van Patten said, accuracy is a byproduct of language acquisition, not the cause of the acquisition. So once you acquire the language through massive reading and listening, you then have a chance to become more accurate in your use of the language insofar as grammar is concerned, or also more accurate use of words. And I might add that when I correct English, very often it's not so much grammar as in grammar rules that are a problem, but just the inaccurate use of words. That is not the word we would use for that. So again, vocabulary, and I've said it many times, is the key to accuracy in a foreign language and in your own language. So where I'm coming with all of this is, and of course, I wanted to add to this zone of proximate difficulty, like just that little bit difficult that's sometimes described as 1 plus n. This can vary from person to person. Myself, if I'm studying on Link, I want 10 to 20% unknown words so that I can grow my vocabulary more quickly. If I had to rely on material that was just a little bit difficult with only 2 or 3% or 5% unknown words, it would take me forever to grow my vocabulary. One other thing is, when it comes to activities in the classroom, I like activities that are easy, that don't force me to think. That is that zone of proximate difficulty. Just a little difficult, but easy. So Piotr, with his Real Polish at realpolish.pl, he asks you questions about the text or the story that he's told, but he gives you the answer before he asks you. So you don't have to scratch your brain to find the answer. You just have to remember it for a couple of seconds and then repeat it back to him. I think that's part of the success of Duolingo. You don't learn a lot, but whatever you're doing is relatively easy to do. And I think this is a lesson for us at Link. We've got to introduce more of that kind of activity, which gives people a sense of satisfaction and achievement. They feel good about themselves. But what we really want them to do is go back to continue listening and reading. And if we can train learners to become independent learners, and that means in the case of school children, if we can spend the first 2-3 years of schooling making sure that every kid is a good reader for his or her age. In other words, forget the other learning social skills or learning, dancing around, whatever they do in grade 1. Just focus on reading. And I think there are ways of making that interesting. Let them choose the stories that interest them, give them audio with the text. I even think the kinds of statistics that we generate at Link with how many words they've learned, little ding-dongs going off as they achieve different milestones, assuming they have an iPad, of course, but without that, some other way of making the absolute focus for the first 3 years, that there should be no child that goes from grade 3 to grade 4 that doesn't have a significant vocabulary. And I think the technology is there to do that, and that is far more important than getting kids to make videos, edit videos, post stuff to Facebook and all this other stuff, teaching them 21st century literacy, whatever. I think all of that is a bit of a smokescreen and detracts us or distracts us from the fundamental task of ensuring that in our society people learn to read, because once they can read well, they can learn on their own, or if they're in a school or university, they have a chance to actually follow what's being taught, to read up, to enrich their knowledge and stuff, because most of the knowledge, at least academic knowledge, we have to acquire, and that includes languages, from outside. We don't have it inside. We've got to acquire it through massive listening and reading. And if we don't have the skills, if we don't have the vocabulary, we can't even listen. We don't understand what's being said. And so I go back to what Krashen says, and that is that compelling input, a little bit difficult, depending on your ability to cope with difficulty. And I fully recognize that as an experienced language learner, I can deal with, vagueness, uncertainty, fuzziness in my text, where someone who is less confident may want to be more, they want to understand everything before they move on. But maybe there again, we can persuade them that that's not necessary. Even for someone reading in their own language, they kind of 80% understood it. That's good. If you enjoy it, that's keep reading. And just let the brain gradually adjust to this input of language and increase your ability to cope with language. And once you do that, then your ability to output will come along. So a bit of a ramble. Went well past it, and then it's going to be even longer if I tack on these videos from Boston, but that's what I wanted to get off my chest. So now, get my handy-dandy remote thing here, and we'll shut this down, I hope. No, that didn't shut it down. Hi there, it's day 3. Behind me is the original site of the Boston Tea Party. I'm having a great time in Boston. I like the city. And I'm heading off to have a cup of coffee and a bun before I start day 3. And I got my goofy Southwestern France World Rugby Tournament 2007 beret on. Keep the sun out of my eyes. Bye for now. Hi there, here I am about to enter the language convention here. Fortunately, I arrived a day early and we didn't have these enormous lineups to get in, but looking forward. And just to get us in the mood, here is this African dance. Language learning is all about the mood.
Stand because I've been sitting down a lot, and also because I'm so short. If I stand up here, you're gonna think I'm taller than I am. Because you're down there, and it makes you look up. God, he's taller than I thought. Okay, I'm glad that Steve went first because he actually liked.
So basically, this is the exhibit part. Publishers, schools, different regions of the world where they're promoting place to study. Just one beside the other. China is big, Chinese, Spanish seem to be the biggest languages. And this is the booth, and there's Carol explaining to people, lots of interest in her material, graded readers for various languages. Very impressive, this whole movement towards more comprehensive.
2 years. Oh, you just started? Yes. Yeah.
So there we go.